The sun was setting on a peaceful suburban street when a sleek gray BMW pulled into the driveway of number 2847 Cedar Avenue. Behind the wheel sat a woman in mint green scrubs, her hair neatly tied back, and dark circles under her eyes, telling the story of another exhausting 12-hour shift at the city hospital. She had just finished a complicated brain surgery that saved a young child's life. But right now, all she wanted was to kick off her shoes and sink into her comfortable couch. This beautiful Victorian-style house had caught her eye the moment her real estate agent showed it to her. With its wraparound porch and bay windows, it stood out among the other homes in this upscale neighborhood. She had worked hard for 15 years to afford a home like this. Countless nights on call, endless surgeries, and years of student loans finally paid off. As she gathered her laptop bag and a small cooler that held her half-eaten lunch, she noticed how quiet the street was. The only sounds were birds chirping their evening songs and the distant laughter of children playing somewhere down the block. A gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from her newly planted garden. This peaceful moment was exactly why she had chosen this neighborhood. She glanced at her phone. 3 missed calls from the hospital and a text from her mother asking about Sunday dinner. Just another typical day in the life of a busy doctor. Her fingers had just wrapped around her house keys when she heard it. The distinct sound of a car engine slowing down behind her. In her rearview mirror, she caught the reflection of red and blue lights, subtle but present, from a patrol car that had just turned onto her street. At first, she didn't think much of it. Police cars often patrolled this area, one of the selling points of this high-end neighborhood. She continued gathering her things, planning out her evening. A quick shower, maybe order some takeout from that new Thai place down the street, and finally catch up on her favorite medical drama series. The patrol car crept slower, its tires crunching on the fallen leaves that scattered across the asphalt. Something about the way it moved made her pause. Through her car's side mirror, she watched as the vehicle came to a complete stop right behind her BMW. The hair on the back of her neck stood up when she heard the distinctive click of a car door opening. She remembered the conversation she had with her colleague just last week about his welcome to the neighborhood experience. One that had ended with him having to prove he lived in his own home. Never did she think she would find herself in a similar situation, especially not after such an emotionally draining day at work. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the subtle jingling of equipment on a utility belt. Her hand tightened around her house keys, and she took a deep breath, reminding herself of who she was. One of the city's top neurosurgeons, a homeowner, a respected professional. Yet somehow, in this moment, none of those accomplishments seemed to matter. The security cameras she'd installed during move-in were recording everything, their tiny red lights blinking steadily from their discreet positions by the porch. She'd had them installed as a precaution, never imagining they'd be documenting something like this. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd bought them to protect herself from intruders, not to prove she belonged in her own driveway. Just as she turned to face the approaching officer, her phone buzzed again. Another emergency call from the hospital. But that would have to wait. Right now, she had a different kind of emergency to handle, one that no amount of medical training had prepared her for. The police officer stepped out of his vehicle with one hand resting near his holster. The flashing lights from his patrol car now fully activated, casting alternating red and blue shadows across the well-manicured lawn. The whole scene felt surreal, like something out of a movie, except this was happening right here on her own property. "Ma'am, what's your business at this residence?" His voice was stern and authoritative, cutting through the evening quiet. Several neighbors' porch lights flickered on, curious faces appearing in windows. She could feel her eyes watching the scene unfold, probably wondering what was happening at the newest addition to their neighborhood. She took another deep breath, keeping her voice steady as she replied, "I live here. I just got home from work." She gestured toward her scrubs, hoping the officer would notice her professional appearance, the hospital ID still clipped to her pocket, the BMW's personalized license plate that matched her credentials. But the officer wasn't easily convinced. "We've had several reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, taking a step closer. "Can you provide some identification and proof that you reside here?" His tone suggested he already made up his mind about the situation, despite the evidence right in front of him. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her work bag. Years of performing delicate brain surgeries with steady hands, yet here she was, shaking while trying to prove she belonged in her own driveway. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just hours ago, she had saved someone's life, and now she was being treated like a potential criminal. As she searched for her wallet, her phone buzzed again. The hospital was still trying to reach her, probably about the post-op patient from earlier. The situation was becoming more frustrating by the minute. She was needed at the hospital, but instead, she was standing here, trying to convince someone she had the right to enter her own home. The officer watched her every move with suspicious eyes. "Please keep your hands where I can see them," he instructed, as if she might suddenly become a threat. She moved slowly, deliberately, remembering all the conversations she'd had with friends and family about moments exactly like this one. "Here's my driver's license," she said, carefully pulling out her wallet. "The address matches this house. I also have the closing documents on my phone, and my realtor can confirm everything." She spoke clearly and professionally, the same way she would explain a complicated procedure to a patient's family. A car drove by slowly, the passengers clearly rubbernecking at the scene. Some of her new neighbors had ventured onto their porches now, whispering among themselves. She recognized the elderly couple from next door, the ones who had yet to welcome her to the neighborhood despite her friendly waves and attempts at small talk. The cool evening air had turned chilly, or maybe it was just the situation making her shiver. Her stomach growled, reminding her that she'd skipped lunch to finish her rounds early. All she had wanted was a quiet evening at home, but instead, she was standing here, putting on a masterclass in patience and dignity. The officer took her license, studying it with exaggerated thoroughness. He spoke into his radio, requesting a check on her information. Each passing minute felt like an hour, the weight of the situation growing heavier on her shoulders. She thought about all the sacrifices she'd made to get here, the long years of medical school, residency, establishing her practice, only to be questioned about her right to exist in this space. "Stay right here," the officer commanded, walking back to his patrol car with her license. Through his car window, she could see him typing on his computer, probably running her information through the system. She pulled out her phone, opening her photos to find pictures from moving day, knowing she might need even more proof. This wasn't her first experience with prejudice, but it was certainly one of the most blatant. The humiliation of the moment grew deeper as more neighbors gathered to watch. She stood there in her wrinkled scrubs, still wearing her surgical cap, feeling like a spectacle in front of people who should have been her new community. A young mother quickly ushered her children inside, as if the scene unfolding was somehow inappropriate for young eyes. The worst part wasn't the officer's suspicious glares or even the growing audience. It was the familiar ache in her chest, the one that reminded her that no matter how many lives she saved in the operating room or how many degrees hung on her wall, some people would only see what they wanted to see. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from her colleague at the hospital. "Emergency consultation needed. Patient from this morning showing concerning symptoms." She looked at the message, then at the officer still sitting in his patrol car, and felt torn between her duty as a doctor and her current reality as a suspect in her own driveway. "Officer," she called out, keeping her voice steady despite her growing frustration. "I have an urgent medical situation I need to attend to. I'm a neurosurgeon at City General, and one of my patients needs immediate attention." She held up her hospital badge, its blue and white colors reflecting in the patrol car's lights. The officer emerged from his car, his face unchanged by her explanation. "Ma'am, this won't take long if you cooperate. We've had several break-ins in this area, and we need to be thorough." His words were professional, but his tone suggested he'd already decided she didn't belong here. A car pulled into the driveway next door, and her elderly neighbor stepped out, grocery bags in hand. Instead of offering support or confirmation that she lived there, the woman hurried inside, peeking through her curtains moments later. The silent judgment stung more than any direct confrontation could have. She decided to take matters into her own hands. "Would you like to see the security camera footage?" she offered, pulling up the app on her phone. "It shows me coming and going from this house for the past month. You can see me moving in, bringing furniture, planting those jasmine bushes by the porch." Her voice remained calm, though her patience was wearing thin. The evening was growing darker, and the mosquitoes were starting to buzz around the patrol car's lights. She swatted one away from her face, wondering how much longer this would go on. Her stomach growled again, louder this time, a reminder that she'd been standing here for what felt like an eternity. The security camera footage played on her phone, showing her gardening just last weekend, wearing an old t-shirt and jeans, carefully planting the flowers her mother had recommended for the front yard. "See, that's me, right there," she pointed out, trying to keep the exhaustion from her voice. The officer watched the video with the same skeptical expression. A group of joggers passed by, slowing their pace to observe the scene. She recognized them from her morning runs, the same people who would cross the street when they saw her approaching, despite her friendly waves. Now they whispered among themselves, no doubt adding this incident to their neighborhood gossip. Her phone buzzed yet again. Another message from the hospital. The patient's situation was becoming more urgent. She felt the weight of her responsibility as a doctor pressing against the absurdity of her current situation. Lives could be at stake, yet here she was, proving her right to exist in her own space. The security lights on her porch automatically clicked on as darkness fell, illuminating the house numbers she'd carefully chosen. Elegant brass digits that matched the Victorian style of the home. Even these seemed to mock her now, a reminder of how she'd thoughtfully planned every detail of her dream home, never imagining she'd have to defend her presence in it. Just as she was about to speak again, she heard another police siren in the distance, growing louder. The officer had called for backup, apparently deciding that one patrol car wasn't enough to handle a tired doctor trying to enter her own home after a long day of saving lives. Two more patrol cars pulled up to the scene, their sirens cutting through the peaceful evening air before falling silent. Red and blue lights now bathed the entire street in an eerie glow, making the situation feel even more surreal. The doctor stood her ground, though her heart was racing beneath her calm exterior. She pulled out her phone again, this time to call her realtor. As she dialed the number, she noticed her hands were steady. The same steadiness that had helped her through countless surgeries was now helping her maintain her composure in this ridiculous situation. The realtor answered on the second ring, immediately recognizing the urgency in her voice. "I need your help," she explained quietly, aware of the officers watching her every move. "I'm standing in my driveway, and the police don't believe I live here." Her realtor's gasp of disbelief was audible even through the phone. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, came the quick response. "Don't go anywhere," as if she had a choice. The new officers approached, conferring with the first one in hushed tones. She could catch snippets of their conversation, suspicious activity, recent break-ins, just checking it out. One of them, a female officer, kept glancing her way with what almost looked like embarrassment. Her phone buzzed again with another hospital update. Patient showing signs of increased intracranial pressure. Need your expertise ASAP. The weight of her responsibility pressed down harder. Somewhere across town, a patient needed her help, while she stood here trying to prove she had the right to enter her own home. A small crowd had gathered now, maintaining what they probably thought was a respectful distance. She recognized faces from her morning jogs, from trips to the local coffee shop, from countless attempts at friendly waves that went unreturned. Some had their phones out, probably recording the whole thing. She wondered if they would ever see her as anything other than an outsider. The female officer finally approached her, clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, you say you're a neurosurgeon?" Her tone was slightly softer than her colleagues. The doctor nodded, pulling out her hospital ID badge for what felt like the 100th time. "Yes, and I have a patient in critical condition who needs my attention. Every minute we spend here could have serious consequences." A car pulled up across the street, and her realtor stepped out, walking briskly toward the scene with a folder tucked under her arm. The relief on the doctor's face was visible. Finally, someone who could vouch for her presence here. The realtor's heels clicked against the pavement as she approached, her professional demeanor masking her obvious anger at the situation. "Officers," the realtor called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "I can verify that this house was purchased by my client last month. I have all the documentation right here." She pulled out papers from her folder, proving what should have been obvious from the start. The night air had grown chilly, and the doctor wrapped her arms around herself, still wearing nothing but her thin scrubs. She thought about the warm jacket hanging just inside her front door, mere feet away yet completely inaccessible. The absurdity of it all, being locked out of her own home by people who were supposed to protect and serve, wasn't lost on her. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Some looked concerned, others curious, but most just stood there, watching. She wondered how many of them would come forward to greet her tomorrow. How many would pretend this never happened? How many would still cross the street when they saw her coming? Her realtor spread the closing documents on the hood of the patrol car, pointing out dates, signatures, and official stamps. The first officer studied them with the same skepticism he'd shown her driver's license, but now there was a slight shift in his posture. Perhaps the first sign that this ridiculous situation might finally be coming to an end. The evidence was mounting up on the hood of the police car. House closing documents, property tax receipts, utility bills, and even photos from the day she got the keys. Her realtor pointed to each piece of paper with growing frustration, explaining the details to the officers who seemed increasingly uncomfortable with the situation they had created. "Here's the purchase agreement, signed and notarized," her realtor said firmly, tapping the official seal. "And here are the property tax payments, all current. These utility bills show service has been in her name for over a month now." The realtor's voice carried authority that seemed to finally penetrate the officer's skepticism. The doctor's phone vibrated again. This time, it was the chief of surgery. She excused herself to take the call, walking a few steps away from the group. "I know about the patient," she said quietly into the phone. "I'm dealing with a situation at my house. Police officers." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Her chief understood immediately. "This is unacceptable." The chief's voice crackled through the speaker. "Put me on speakerphone with the officers." But she hesitated, not wanting to escalate things further. She'd handled this with dignity so far, and she wanted to maintain that approach even though her patience was wearing terribly thin. Back at the patrol car, the female officer was now scrolling through the security camera footage on her phone. The screen showed clear images of her moving in, carrying boxes, arranging furniture, and working in the garden. Each frame proved what she'd been saying all along. This was her home, her space, her life they were disrupting. The first officer's face had begun to change. The stern, suspicious look was giving way to something else, perhaps embarrassment, maybe even shame. He kept glancing between the documents and her face, reality slowly sinking in. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably, probably wondering how they would write this up in their report. A breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the scent of her newly planted jasmine flowers. A bitter reminder of how she'd spent the previous weekend making this house her home, only to be treated like an intruder. The security lights cast long shadows across her perfectly manicured lawn, highlighting the welcome mat she'd placed by the front door, its message now seeming painfully ironic. Some of the neighbors who had been watching started to drift away, perhaps feeling ashamed of their own role as silent spectators. Others stayed, their faces showing a mix of emotions: concern, embarrassment, and for some, a dawning recognition of their own prejudices. Her realtor stepped closer, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "This should never have happened," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "My client is a respected neurosurgeon who saves lives every day. She chose this neighborhood because of its reputation for safety and community. Is this how you welcome new residents?" The female officer was the first to break ranks. "Ma'am, I believe we've verified everything we need to," she said, gathering up the documents and handing them back. "We apologize for any inconvenience." The words seemed small compared to the humiliation they'd put her through, but at least they were a start. The first officer cleared his throat, finally stepping back from his aggressive stance. "We were just responding to reports of suspicious activity," he muttered, but his explanation sounded hollow even to his own ears. The truth of what had really happened hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Her phone buzzed once more with another urgent message from the hospital. She held up the screen, showing the emergency notification to the officers. "Now that we've established I do, in fact, live here, may I please enter my home and respond to my patient's needs? Someone's life literally depends on it." The growing realization of what they'd done, delaying emergency medical care because of unfounded suspicions, seemed to finally hit home. The officers began retreating to their vehicles, the lights that had turned her quiet evening into a public spectacle finally switching off one by one. The first officer's demeanor had completely transformed. Gone was the stern, suspicious look, replaced by an uncomfortable shuffle and downcast eyes. He cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Ma'am, we apologize for the misunderstanding." The word misunderstanding hung in the air, inadequate and hollow for what had just transpired. The chief of surgery called again, and this time the doctor answered on speakerphone. "I'm putting together an emergency team." The chief's authoritative voice rang out clearly. "We need you here as soon as possible." The officers exchanged glances, the reality of their actions sinking in deeper. They hadn't just inconvenienced someone, they had potentially put a patient's life at risk. Her realtor wasn't ready to let the matter drop. "I'd like all of your badge numbers," she stated firmly, pulling out her phone to take notes. "This entire incident needs to be documented." A respected medical professional was prevented from responding to an emergency because of... She paused, letting them fill in the blank themselves. The neighbors who remained watching began to approach slowly, their earlier suspicion replaced by shame and regret. The couple from next door, who had rushed inside earlier, now stood on their porch with apologetic faces. The woman held a plate of cookies, a peace offering that felt both touching and tragically late. "I've lived here for 20 years, an elderly man spoke up from the small crowd. "I should have said something sooner. I've seen the doctor coming and going, working in her garden. This should never have happened." His words seemed to break a dam, and other neighbors began to voice their agreement and embarrassment. The female officer was already writing up her report, her pen moving quickly across the paper. "For the record," she said, looking directly at the doctor, "I want to note that you maintained complete professionalism throughout this entire incident. Your hospital should be proud to have you on their staff." It was a small gesture, but the recognition of her dignity in the face of prejudice meant something. A young couple who had been recording the incident on their phones stepped forward. "We have everything on video," they offered. "If you want to file a complaint, we'll be happy to provide the footage." Their support, though late, added to the growing sense that something had shifted in the neighborhood's atmosphere. The doctor checked her phone again. More messages from the hospital, each one more urgent than the last. "I need to go inside now," she said firmly. "My patient can't wait any longer." She took out her house keys, the same ones she'd been holding when this whole ordeal began, and this time no one stopped her from walking toward her front door. The first officer handed back her ID and documents, unable to meet her eyes. "We'll be conducting an internal review of this incident," he said quietly. "This isn't what we're supposed to be about." His admission of wrongdoing, though subtle, was clear to everyone present. As she finally reached her front porch, she turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. "I chose this neighborhood because I believed it was a community," she said, her voice tired but strong. "I spend my days saving lives, anyone's life, regardless of who they are or what they look like. I hope tonight helps us all remember that we're better than our prejudices." The security light illuminated her path as she walked to her door, casting a warm glow that seemed to highlight the absurdity of the past hour. Behind her, she could hear the police radios crackling as the officers prepared to leave, their vehicles' engines humming in the background. The neighbors began to disperse, many looking back with expressions that promised future conversations and, perhaps, a chance for real community building. Her realtor called out one last time, "I'll be filing a formal complaint first thing tomorrow morning. This won't be swept under the rug." The determination in her voice made it clear that tonight's events would have lasting consequences, not just for the officers involved, but for the entire neighborhood's understanding of what it means to truly be a community. News of the incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, local community leaders had already called an emergency meeting at the community center. The story had touched a nerve, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about their own biases and the way they treated newcomers. Back at the hospital, the doctor had managed to stabilize her patient despite the delay. Her colleagues were outraged when they heard what had happened. The chief of surgery personally visited the police station to file a complaint, emphasizing how the officer's actions had put a patient's life at risk. "What happened last night wasn't just about me," the doctor explained to a group of concerned residents who had gathered at her front door that morning. Some brought breakfast, others carried welcome baskets, and a few simply came to apologize. Their genuine concern was touching, but it also highlighted how it had taken such a dramatic incident to break down the invisible barriers. The elderly couple next door had tears in their eyes as they shared their own story. "We've lived here for 30 years, the wife said, her voice shaking. "We never thought ourselves as prejudiced, but last night showed us that staying silent is just as harmful. We should have been better neighbors from the start." A young mother pushed her stroller up the driveway, her two small children clutching handmade cards. "My kids couldn't sleep last night," she explained. "They kept asking why the police were being mean to the doctor who fixes people's brains. I didn't have a good answer for them." The cards, decorated with crayon drawings of hearts and rainbows, now sat on the doctor's kitchen counter. The neighborhood's online community forum was buzzing with activity. People who had witnessed the incident shared their videos, while others expressed their shock and dismay. The thread quickly evolved into a discussion of creating a more welcoming community. Plans were made for regular neighborhood gatherings, a diversity committee, and better communication between residents. Local news reporters had picked up the story, and their vans lined the street. The doctor declined most interviews, preferring to focus on her patients and her work. "I didn't ask to be the face of this issue," she told a persistent reporter. "But if what happened to me can help prevent it from happening to someone else, then maybe some good can come from it." The Homeowners Association president knocked on her door around noon, carrying a formal letter of apology and an invitation to join their board. "We need your voice," he admitted. "We need to do better, and that starts with having different perspectives in our leadership." Her phone kept buzzing with messages of support from colleagues, patients, and even strangers who had heard about the incident. One message particularly touched her. It was from a young medical student. "Your dignity in the face of prejudice gives me hope. Thank you for showing us how to stand strong." The police department launched an internal investigation. The female officer who had been present that night came by to provide her card and personal contact information. "Your composure last night was remarkable," she said quietly. "It made many of us realize we need better training and awareness." Throughout the day, neighbors continued to stop by. Some brought food, Others offered help with her garden, and many simply wanted to talk. The conversations were sometimes awkward, often emotional, but always honest. People shared their own experiences with prejudice, acknowledged their biases, and expressed their desire to create real change. By evening, her front porch had become an impromptu gathering place. People brought chairs and snacks, engaging in the kind of neighborly conversation that should have happened months ago. The jasmine she had planted filled the air with its sweet scent, and for the first time since moving in, she felt like she was truly part of the community. A week after the incident, the police department held a press conference. The chief of police stood before the cameras, his face solemn as he addressed the situation. "What happened that night reflects a deeper issue that we can no longer ignore," he announced. "Starting next month, all our officers will undergo extensive bias training. But more importantly, we're creating a community advisory board to help guide our policies and practices." The doctor's realtor had followed through on her promise. The formal complaint she filed included video evidence, witness statements, and a detailed timeline of events. The investigation moved quickly, leading to the suspension of the first officer pending further review. His body camera footage had revealed the full extent of his unwarranted suspicion and prejudiced behavior. At the hospital, things had changed too. The incident sparked important conversations about discrimination in healthcare. The doctor's colleagues shared their own experiences, leading to the creation of a diversity and inclusion task force. Sometimes it takes one incident to open everyone's eyes, the chief of surgery remarked during a staff meeting. The neighborhood transformation was perhaps the most remarkable. The same streets that had once felt unwelcoming were now alive with genuine community spirit. Someone suggested a monthly block party, and the idea took off. The first gathering was held right in front of the doctor's house, symbolizing the community's commitment to change. "I never expected my story to have such an impact," the doctor shared during a community meeting. She stood at the podium, still wearing her scrubs after a long surgery. "But what matters isn't just what happened that night. It's what we do next. How do we make sure this never happens to anyone else?" Her words inspired action. The Homeowners Association created a welcome committee for new residents. The elderly couple next door volunteered to lead it, turning their regret into positive change. "We want everyone who moves here to feel at home from day one," they explained, holding up their newly printed welcome packets. Local schools reached out, asking the doctor to speak to students about resilience and standing up against prejudice. She visited a high school science class, where students were more interested in her experiences as a neurosurgeon. "That's exactly the point," she told them. "We should be judged by what we do, not how we look." The female police officer who had been present that night became an unexpected ally. She started advocating for change within the department, using the incident as a teaching moment during training sessions. "We're here to protect and serve everyone," she would emphasize. "Our badges come with responsibility, not just authority." Community leaders from other neighborhoods started reaching out, wanting to learn from what happened. The incident had sparked a wider conversation about inclusion and community policing. Town hall meetings were organized to discuss how other communities could prevent similar situations. The doctor's patient from that night made a full recovery. When he learned about what had delayed his doctor's arrival, he and his family joined the growing movement for change. They shared their story at community meetings, putting a human face on the potential consequences of prejudice. One evening, as the doctor pulled into her driveway after another long day at the hospital, she noticed something different. The neighbors who once rushed inside now waved warmly. Children playing nearby called out, "Hi, doctor." The security lights came on, illuminating new welcome flags that lined the street, a small but meaningful symbol of change. Her phone buzzed, not with messages about discrimination this time, but with updates about the community's progress. The advisory board she helped create was making real changes in police training. The neighborhood watch had been reformed with a focus on building bridges, not barriers. Even the local paper had started a regular column about community inclusion. 1 year had passed since that unforgettable night in the driveway. The doctor stood in her garden, tending to the jasmine bushes that had grown thick and lush. The sweet scent reminded her how far things had come. A newspaper lay on her porch, its headline reading "Local Community Celebrates 1 Year of Transformation." The changes went far beyond just her neighborhood. The police department had completely revised its training programs. The first officer from that night had gone through extensive rehabilitation, counseling, and bias training. He had even requested to meet with the doctor to apologize personally. That meeting became a powerful teaching moment for other officers. "I never thought my simple desire to come home after work would spark such change," she reflected during a community gathering. The same driveway where she had once stood surrounded by police cars was now filled with chairs for the monthly neighborhood meet-up. Children played freely on her lawn, parents chatted on her porch, and elderly neighbors brought their famous home-cooked dishes. The hospital where she worked had become a model for other medical institutions. They created a mentorship program for minority medical students named in her honor. "The best revenge against prejudice is success," she told a group of eager students, and helping others achieve their dreams despite the barriers they might face. Her realtor had become one of her closest friends and strongest allies. Together, they started a program helping minorities navigate the home buying process and understand their rights. "It's not just about selling houses anymore," the realtor explained at a community meeting. "It's about building homes where everyone feels safe and welcomed." The neighborhood watch transformed into a community support group. Instead of looking for suspicious activity, they focused on helping neighbors in need. When a young family moved in down the street, residents rushed to welcome them with open arms, sharing the story of how their community had learned to be better. The female police officer who had been present that night was now leading the department's community relations unit. She often used the incident as a teaching example. "Sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most important lessons," she would say during training sessions. Her work had helped bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. Local schools incorporated the story into their curriculum, teaching students about prejudice, courage, and community responsibility. The doctor occasionally visited classrooms, not just to talk about the incident, but to inspire young minds about careers in medicine. "Your dream job doesn't care what you look like," she would tell them. "It cares about your dedication and hard work." The elderly couple next door had become like family. They shared Sunday dinners, gardening tips, and stories about their lives. "We learned that being a good neighbor isn't just about living next door," they often said. "It's about opening your heart and mind." The security cameras that had once provided evidence of her residency now captured different scenes. Children delivering holiday cards, neighbors bringing meals when she worked late shifts, community gatherings that spilled onto her lawn. The footage told a new story of acceptance and unity. As she stood on her porch that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in beautiful colors, her phone buzzed. It was a message from a young doctor in another state who had faced a similar situation. "Your story gave me strength," it read. "Thank you for showing us that change is possible." The doctor smiled, looking at her home, not just the physical building, but the community it represented. The jasmine she planted had spread, its vines reaching across fences, connecting yard to yard. It seemed like a perfect metaphor for how one person's experience could touch so many lives, breaking down barriers and bringing people together in unexpected ways. This wasn't just a story about prejudice and injustice anymore. It had become a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of community, and the possibility of real change. As neighbors waved and called out greetings on their evening walks, she knew that sometimes the hardest moments in life could lead to the most beautiful transformations.